Let's get through a number of typical bleak midwinter jobs on some fun guitars. To start off with, we've got a Blue Ridge. This is a BR-163, which is like a triple O. Blue Ridge is, what should we call them, kind of an upper mid-level instrument made by the Saga Corporation. Saga is one of the biggest guitar builders in the world. This is Chinese made with a lot of care and some pretty good materials. Has solid wood throughout it. Indian rosewood back and sides. I say triple O, but to me it feels almost like a hybrid between a 50s Martin and something like a Kalamazoo or something. It's really light. It's got a long scale. Nice guitar, really. My, that's a lot of fancy pearl. I don't know, 80 years ago, something like this would have represented a full day's worth of very fiddly work. Bunch of broken blades. You get a blister on your thumb from sawing so long, and you have to stop every once in a while to swear. But now both the inlay and the recess that it goes into are done so perfectly with a CNC machine. There's like no risk. The operator basically looks at the clock while it's going on. In former times, maybe it earned this level of gaudiness, if you know what I mean. It's like a nudie suit. There's a lot of work involved. It's there. I don't hate it. I just don't see the point, really. Actually, you know what it does is it distracts from what is a really beautiful headstock shape. I really like this. It's got this very refined, curved sensibility, which gets lost because you got all that on it. So the owner says he's noticed a considerable rise in the action in the last little while, and that corresponded to a period of drying out. He's got it in a humidified room now, but it's still high. Here in eastern Canada, during the cold snaps, ambient humidity can take a serious nosedive, like 20% overnight. And that's a lot for a guitar to deal with. Sometimes household humidifiers can't keep up with it. And here in the lower city of Hamilton, we're all living in 120-year-old homes, many with stone foundations, and the moisture just gets sucked up and away into the polar vortex. Places like the southwest US are also super dry, of course, but they tend to stay that way. So if you can slow down the humidity loss in a guitar over a year or two, they'll usually stay pretty stable ever after. Whereas up here, it's every 6 months they've got to swell or contract as much as a 1/16 of an inch across their width. And this is one of the reasons most builders will force the soundboard and the back of the guitar into an arched shape. Because the sides are a pretty rigid structure. They don't move very much, and that arch adds a little bit of extra width to the soundboard. So if I have a guitar like this, you know, it might take a board that's, say, 360 millimeters wide to cover that distance from side to side if it's flat. If it's arched, it could be 362 millimeters. Gains us a little bit, so that rather than splitting immediately when they get dry, there's room for them to flatten out somewhat before they snap. Doesn't always work, but it's like a measure of precaution. This is January, and this top is likely to have flattened out some, taking the bridge with it, and theoretically lowering the action. That's why this is a puzzle. We'd expect the opposite to what's happening. However, sighting the neck, I can see there's more relief here than I'd like. Now, sometimes the neck dries out, and it can shrink in width. This is the time of year when fret ends can be exposed. It starts to feel sharp. Sometimes if the lacquer has been sprayed over the nut, it'll crack because the nut doesn't shrink at the same rate as the wood does. And oftentimes the retaining nuts on tuner bushings, if they're the screw-in kind, will loosen up a little bit at this time of year, which can cause a sympathetic buzz sometimes, which is really kind of annoying. Because the headstock gets microscopically thinner. Now the expansion and contraction of a board is far greater across its width than end to end. On the end grain side, it doesn't shrink very much at all. But there can be a tiny bit, and that sometimes can be enough to effectively loosen the truss rod a hair. As we mentioned in the past, truss rods can be super sensitive. Tiny adjustments can make a big difference. So I'm wondering if maybe that's part of what's going on here. Yeah, I'll measure the action at the 12th fret like I do. and we're just over 8/64ths. It's around 3.2 millimeters, about 130 thousandths on the bass side. And on treble, that's looking like 7/64ths, which is about 2.8 millimeters, around 110 thousandths, which is high. This is about as high as I would ever set up a guitar for someone on purpose. Most people would want something lower than this. Okay, checking out the relief, I got a capo at the first fret, and I'll hold down the low E string somewhere around the body joint. I'll measure with the feeler gauge at about the 6th fret. And in this case, we're somewhere around 14 thousandths of an inch, which is not astronomical. It's a little on the high side. I find most steel string guitars can do something under 10 thousandths. The Martin standard is around 5 or 6 thousandths, if I recall. So we can crank that truss rod a little bit and see if that does anything to our benefit. The truss rod in this case is accessible at the body end through the sound hole. It's probably the 4 millimeter size that a lot of the Asian builders use. Yeah, 4 millimeters. So I'm going to start off by backing off the rod a little bit just to make sure that things are okay here. Yeah, it seems to function fine. So I'm going to give it that much of a turn, which is probably, if we started off at midnight, this is like 1 o'clock. So like 1/12 of a turn. That should be enough to do something significant that we can measure. We started off around 14 thousandths relief, and now we're down to about 12. So we're going in the right direction. Okay, that's starting to get a bit more snug feeling. The relief is now 9 thousandths. One more little bit of adjustment there, and the relief is now 7 thousandths. So that was the better part of 1/4 of a turn of the truss rod, and we've halved it. So let's see what the action looks like now. So now we've got just over 7/64ths on the bass, and somewhere just slightly less than 6 on the treble. So that would be, again, about 2.8 millimeters, about 2.4 on the treble, 110 thousandths-ish, about 94 thousandths. Better than it was. You can really feel the difference on the treble side. There's a definite margin there, a break, where things feel much too high. This is now playable, but I think we can do better. If I'm reading the serial number on this thing correctly, this was probably built in 2009, which is now 12 or 13 years ago, folks. If you can believe it. It may be time to take down the saddle height a little bit. There is a little bit of a bellying effect going on behind the bridge. That happens. You can't get too excited about it. If you've got yourself a 12-year-old X-braced guitar like this that doesn't show some bellying, it may have been overbuilt. There's a chunk of real estate back here past the end of the bridge plate with no braces under it. We're trying to reach a very tenuous kind of equilibrium between getting enough support to keep the top from collapsing and not so much that it chokes out the ability of the plate to produce good volume and good sound. Each soundboard is different. Some are stiffer, some require more help from the braces, some are going to belly higher than others. Over time we've got the body changing shape due to the tension on it. Eventually torque wins, and the bridge starts to rock forward, the belly comes up. At which point there's a choice to be made. You either live with the super high action that results, you lower the saddle height, or you do a neck reset. It's kind of a natural progression. After a decade or so, we lower the saddle. When the guitar is about 25 or 30 years old, usually it's time for us to reset the neck because there's nothing more we can do. Now there are things we can do to prolong the intervals in that progression. Number one is to keep it in the case so it's less subject to changes in humidity, because the case acts like a buffer. And the less the guitar has to move to accommodate changes in humidity, the less the other shifts in geometry seem to occur. Number two would be to tune it down if you're not playing it. Not all the way, but if you're in E, take it down to like C or C sharp. Not everyone has the discipline to do that, but less string tension equals less deforming. And lastly, it's good to have the neck relief checked out every once in a while and corrected if necessary, like we just did. Because if the neck takes a forward bow and it goes through a number of those seasonal changes, it'll want to stay there. It really takes a set. And you got to put more pressure on the truss rod to get it to straighten. So you're putting more force on the end grain of the neck, and that again can have unforeseen effects if things get very wet and the neck swells up. Looking at the portion of the saddle that stands above the surface of the bridge, there's good height there. Slightly more than 1/8 of an inch tall on the base side, which is again about 3.2 millimeters. And that can come down safely, usually, to 3/32 of an inch or thereabouts, about 2.8 millimeters. Same thing on the treble side. It starts off proportionally lower, and it can come down proportionally less, but it can come down. And again, this is an open-ended equation, because how low is too low? Well, we need sufficient downward pressure on the saddle to provide a driving force on the soundboard and produce good volume and good tone. There's a qualitative aspect too, because having proportionally more of the saddle under the surface of the bridge often yields, imprecise language here, but a more woody sounding tone versus something that's more bright and strident sounding that happens if you have a lot of saddle height and a lot of saddle exposed. So it's a balance again. The people who wax poetic about tone, saying that I don't care if my guitar has 9/64 action, I do it for the tone, man. Sometimes they do it at the expense of playability. Because if you want to move around fast, you might need a lower saddle. If all you play is like whole notes at 100 beats per minute, maybe a very high action is fine for you. But it won't be the right thing for everybody. There's no setup that's going to satisfy everybody. To satisfy myself that there's nothing else structural going on, I can have a look at things inside the guitar. I do that by just loosening the 2 center strings so I can get my mirror in there and get a good look. But I still have some tension on the soundboard. And what I'm going to do is look at the bridge plate and the braces to make sure that there's nothing that's obviously loose. And everything looks pretty good and tight, and just as I would expect. This is a rosewood bridge pad, which are usually slightly more rigid than the maple variety. And it's fairly thick too. I don't see any obvious gaps. Everything is nice and neat in its construction. It's a good idea to check the back edge of the bridge to make sure that it hasn't come unglued and is starting to lift. The other place to check with the rising action is the end of the heel here where it meets the body. I want to make sure there isn't a crack or an opening forming between these two parts, which would suggest that maybe the dovetail is loose or broken in its socket. This seems to be rock solid. When I'm taking the bridge pins out, I actually have a little holder here which keeps them in the correct order. It's not such an issue with plastic bridge pins, but sometimes the wooden ones can be fit quite differently from hole to hole, depending on how accurate the turning was. Even though it's usually obvious, I always mark the front of the saddle when I take it out. I'll use my dial calipers to mark the amount for removal. I'm going to start with about 1/32 of an inch on the bass side and a little bit less on the treble. Then I join the lines up, and using sandpaper on a flat surface, I'll work it down to the correct height. Sometimes it's easier to hold the saddle on its side on my miniature shooting board. And I check to make sure the bottom is square to the sides of the saddle. Sometimes the bottom of the saddle slot isn't flat, which is sort of a bad situation, in which case I gotta drag out the router and fix it. But in this case it's fine. I'll check the saddle too. I want good contact between these two parts. For this kind of repetitive setup, it pays to keep the strings on. I hold them in place with a capo. You have to be willing to go back and forth over and over again until it's just right. With that, the action is now 6/64 on the bass, just under 5 on the treble, which is a reduction of more than 25%. Folks, that's night and day. Completely different playing experience. There are some ancillary benefits as well. Playing in tune is easier because you're not having to stretch the strings so much to get them down to the fret tops. I notice it in the first position chords. So now I can take the strings off clean and polish the frets and oil the board. Right, you have questions about oil on fingerboards, and will it prevent fret sprout? Probably not. Traditionally, and we're going back hundreds of years here, in woodworking, certain kinds of self-polymerizing oils, namely walnut oil, linseed oil, in Asia they were using tung oil, tung being a kind of nut. These were used to create a semi-gloss surface at a time when resin-based gloss varnishes were not easy to make. They were expensive, and half the time the people who were making them blew themselves up in their production because they were having to boil things like turpentine. These oils could be applied in multiple coats, and the excess wiped all the way off, leaving just a trace on the surface to dry or self-polymerize. Then it was repeated. Do that a bunch of times and they develop a kind of low gloss sheen, and they form a sort of semi-durable surface. The other thing they're used for is to slow down the loss of moisture from the wood in dry conditions. Oil and water being famous for not being friendly with each other. So rather than drying out and cracking in 5 days, it might take 10. Who knows, by which time it might have rained by then. So in modern day use, we don't want to build up a thick, glossy surface coat of oil because it tends to get really sticky after a while, and it holds on to dirt, which is kind of why I discourage the use of those previously mentioned drying oils, not because they're bad, but most people use way too much of them unless they've got some practice. And when I say wipe off the excess, I mean every bit of it that you possibly can remove. You put it on, let it sit for a minute or two, and then just scrub. So if we apply it as a rudimentary moisture loss barrier, we're just wetting the wood with a single coat using a non-polymerizing or non-drying oil. Take most of it off and just leave it there. You could use petroleum jelly and get the same effect, just like chapped lips or something. There's nothing magical about citrus oils other than their ability to act as a kind of cleaner as well as shining things up. So they're acting like a 2-in-1, basically. In any case, the effect is not that long lasting, and really, if we're down to it, makes the wood look nice. It's not really going to moisturize the wood because we're not adding water with it, and it keeps water out as much as it keeps in. So at this point, I'm just doing this and it looks, wow, the grain pops out. Looks really nice if you get your guitar back and it's got that for a fingerboard. Now then, here is a Taylor 5, is it a 510 or 512 CE, which is pretty high up in their list of models. This one has the potential to be vexing because we're going to go try and track down a weird sympathetic buzz. The patient showed up last year and the buzz was most noticeable when playing Fs, especially when it was amplified. So I probed every brace, checked the electronics, the pickup, the screws in the headstock, and in so doing, somehow the buzz went away, and I don't know what did the trick. However, some months later, things started to dry out, and the buzz not only returned, it got worse, because according to the owner, it spread from the F and expanded to surrounding notes, like F sharp, G. He put it into a humidified case, and it started to retract back to F. So somehow this is related to humidity. You got to find out what's loose and buzzing. So let's plug it in and see what happens. These are still tight, and so is the truss rod. We'll go inside now with an endoscope and have a gander. Here's the expression pickup. Everything around that seems tight. Same with the braces. There's the fingerboard extension bolt. With the expression pickup, before removing the saddle, you have to loosen the contacts slightly with a little tiny Allen key. That's important. These things press against the side of the saddle. It doesn't take much, just about a turn's worth. So we'll remove the strings, and we can pull out the saddle then. And here you can see the contacts. The pickup base is nice and flat as you would expect. I sight the saddle against a light, and there might be a tiny gap in the center. Now this shouldn't cause the issue we're experiencing, but we'll sand it really flat just in case so that we can cross it off the list and don't have to wonder about it. Same thing with the braces. I'm using a feeler gauge to probe everything I can reach again, just to make sure I didn't miss anything the first time. I don't think I tightened the battery compartment screws the last time, so we'll do that too. Here I'm tapping to see if anything reveals itself. Now, there are springs inside, but they'll be compressed when in use. Everything seems good and snug. I made sure the fingerboard extension nut was tight, then I heated up the sticker which covers the neck bolts using a hair dryer and peeled it back. And I snugged those bolts up. Now there was a tiny amount of play in one of them, and I mean super tiny. Okay, maybe there was something in that micron's worth of extra tightening I could get out of the neck screws, but it seems to have dissipated. I'm not hearing it the way I was before. That's the thing. If you do this for long enough, you start to anticipate hearing it, and then you have this psychosomatic reaction where you hear it even if it's not there. And if I listen to it in the background, like, I can hear a slight resonance, which I'm equating with the resonant frequency of the body, which is probably somewhere around F, hence the problem we're having, which might always be there, but it's not audible in play. It's kind of frustrating, you know, have to give this back to the customer and say, hey, it's fixed, but can't lay my finger on exactly what it was. Sometimes it's like that. It's annoying.